Greetings, traveler. Before the lamps dim and sleep begins its slow descent, allow me to open a doorway, one carved not in stone but in memory. Imagine a world raised on the spine of mountains, a world that should have fractured under its own weight, a world that should have vanished long before it ever learned to dream. And yet, here it stands, suspended between earth and sky, the story of the Inca before the strangers from across the sea arrived. How does an empire thrive without iron? How do farmers coax abundance from cliffs? How do roads cross mountains that seem meant to divide the world forever? How does a people braid devotion to the sun into every harvest, every law, every heartbeat? Tonight we will follow the quiet logic of stone highways, the pulse of terraced fields, and the serene fire of a god whose light shaped an empire. Before we begin, settle into stillness, leave behind the noise of the present, and let the distant Cordillera rise in your mind. Feel the thin crystalline air. Hear the slow echo of footsteps on ancient paving stones. Let us walk backward in time. The realm suspended. Above the clouds, the Inca world began with altitude and uncompromising verticality that defined everything from survival to sovereignty. High in the Andean Cordillera, communities clung to ridgelines where the sky felt close enough to reach. The stakes were clear, misjudge the land, and entire generations could crumble. And yet, instead of yielding to the mountain's silence, the Andean peoples turned those heights into scaffolds for empire. Human hands, weathered and steady, traced the cliffs. Families built dwellings of reddish stone, their walls angled slightly inward to hold firm when the earth moved. From these small settlements grew the ideological backbone of what would become the Inca, the belief that the world could be shaped stone by stone into order. One innovation rose above the rest: terracing. Steep slopes, once barren, transformed into ribbons of fertile soil. This idea, simple in concept yet monumental in execution, allowed agriculture to climb where ordinary cultivation failed. It brought security, stability, and surplus. But this was only the beginning, the stone roads that defied the earth. The Inca road system, chasqui racing across miles, messengers carrying knots of quipu, did not emerge from sudden brilliance. It grew from a declaration: the land will not command us. We will command the land. The stakes were immense. Without reliable pathways, there could be no empire. Without movement, there could be no unity. The Andes, fractured and unpredictable, resisted connection, but human determination found a solution through engineering, ritual, and relentless labor. Workers carved paths along precipices where a single misstep meant death. They paved long stretches with tightly fitted stones, some polished smooth, others left textured for traction. Rope bridges of twisted plant fiber suspended travelers over chasms, swaying but resilient. Engineers devised drainage systems to carry off the rains, preserving the roads across seasons. This network became one of the most advanced transportation systems of the pre-modern world, an innovation not of technology, but of will. And still, this was only the beginning. Fields that carried the sun's blessing. Agriculture. The heart of the Inca world was more than sustenance. It was cosmology. Each seed carried a whisper from the ancestors. Each harvest a trace of divine permission. The stakes of these fields were existential. Famine meant spiritual rupture, not merely hunger. Farmers woke before dawn, their breath pale against the morning frost. They pressed their palms to the soil in greeting. They observed the sky with the precision of astronomers, anticipating frost, predicting rains, and reading the intentions of the sun. Potatoes, maize, quinoa crops, adapted over centuries, thrived in microclimates shaped by terraces. The stones absorbed the day's heat, releasing it slowly into the night, protecting fragile shoots from the cold. Irrigation channels, guided by gravity, trickled water into each tier. This was a triumph of ecological intelligence, a partnership between people and landscape in which the mountains themselves seemed to participate. But this was only the beginning. The children of Inti Sun worship, vital, serene, relentless, formed the spiritual spine of Andean civilization. The sun was more than a celestial light. It was kin, guardian, ruler, and witness. The stakes of honoring Inti were cosmic, keeping balance, granting legitimacy to rulers, ensuring the world's continued order. Priests watched dawn from stone observatories, noting the sun's position with meticulous discipline. At solstices, the light aligned with carved markers or flooded temple walls, proving that architecture and cosmos were intertwined. For the people, devotion required neither temples nor titles. Each sunrise carried meaning. Each offering of chicha or maize was an affirmation of gratitude. Even the smallest village understood the reciprocity that anchored their world. This theological innovation, binding empire to celestial order, created unity across vast distances. It shaped politics as much as ritual. But this was only the beginning. The first foundations of empire. Before the arrival of the Spanish, before the collapse and upheaval, the Inca world stood poised between serenity and ambition. Roads strengthened its spine. Fields sustained its breath. The sun sanctified its purpose. Communities grew into provinces, provinces aligned under leadership that claimed descent from the sun itself. Armies marched not to destroy, but to incorporate, to teach, to reorganize. The empire's structure evolved with every conquest, each new territory adding complexity. Yet all still felt young. All still felt as though the world were gathering itself for something larger, something not yet fully seen. And this, too, was only the beginning. The spine of the Four Quarters Empire in the Andean world did not begin with conquest. It began with arrangement and orderly drawing together of landscapes that had long stood apart. As the Inca expanded, they faced a challenge larger than any battlefield: how to bind coast, highland, and jungle into a single body that could breathe as one. The stakes were profound. Fragmentation meant weakness. Unity meant survival. Rulers in Cusco understood that geography itself was their greatest adversary and their greatest resource. Thus they devised a system that seemed almost anatomical, the Tawantinsuyu, the Four Quarters, radiating outward from the navel of their world. Human hands mapped valleys with chords and markers. Administrators recorded populations by quipu, each knot a pulse of lived reality. Technical principles emerged, not merely governance, but a philosophy of balance. No region stood alone. Every province supplied what another lacked. Maize from warm valleys, textiles from the high plains, dried fish from the Pacific coast, the empire became a circulatory system of exchange. It was an innovation in statecraft, suited to mountains, resilient to drought and distance. But this new order was only the beginning. The architects of stone and silence power in the Inca world was expressed not through palaces of gold, but through stone that held firm against wind and time. As the empire matured, its architects began to carve its identity into the land itself. The stakes of every building were political. To erect a temple or fortress was to declare permanence. To sculpt stone was to suggest that rule, like granite, could endure earthquakes and storms. Master builders, called pirca kamayok, shaped blocks by hand. They studied each stone's interior fractures by sight, alone, lifting and setting pieces until they fit without mortar. Walls leaned inward just slightly, a subtle gesture that gave the structures strength against tremors. Terraces rose around administrative centers like layered crowns. These innovations were not displays of vanity, but signals of unity. They told every traveler, every messenger, every visiting leader this empire is deliberate. But stone alone could not hold an empire together. This too was only the beginning. Voices of the Chasquis. No kingdom survived without communication, and no communication system in the pre-modern world rivaled that of the Chasqui, the messengers who ran the lengths of the empire with the precision of a living clock. The stakes of their labor were immediate. Delayed messages meant delayed responses, rebellions unchecked, harvests, unsent, rituals unfulfilled. The Inca needed speed, reliability, and endurance, and so they turned their entire road network into an instrument of governance. Each Chasqui station, perched roughly a day's run apart, held 2 or more relay runners. They lived in modest shelters built from stone and thatch. When a message approached, one runner would sprint onto the next leg carrying quipu verbal reports or small goods. Their lungs adjusted to dizzying altitudes. Their feet learned the contours of pathways carved along cliff edges. This system made distance irrelevant. It allowed rulers in Cusco to sense distant unrest, to monitor the movement of laborers, to guide armies, to announce festivals. It was a triumph of coordination, an empire listening to itself. And yet communication was only one thread of the vast tapestry. Rituals that secured the world. While roads and stone brought structure, ritual brought meaning. Festivals, offerings, and rites served as a quiet dialogue between the people and the cosmos. They stabilized identity and offered assurance that the world's cycles, rainfall, harvest, fertility, would continue. The stakes were existential. Without rituals, the harmony between humans and the unseen forces around them would fracture. Andean cosmology held that the earth was alive, its mountains awake, its waters listening. Priests in white garments observed the sun's arc across the year. Families honored household ancestors with small bundles of coca leaves. Communities gathered at sacred places or huacas, each site breathing with symbolic memory. One innovation of the Inca was not the creation of new rituals, but the weaving together of local ones into a shared calendar. This allowed distant provinces to feel aligned with the empire's spiritual heartbeat. Unity grew not only from conquest, but from synchronized devotion. Still, ritual alone could not maintain empire. Soon the Inca learned to reshape society itself, the web of Ailu and empire. Before the rise of the Inca, Andean life revolved around Ailu extended kin groups who shared land labor and lineage. These communities formed the quiet infrastructure of survival long before cities or armies existed. The stakes of preserving the Ailu were cultural. Disrupt it, an identity would crumble. Sustain it, and the empire would gain stability beyond force. The Inca, recognizing its value, adopted a remarkable solution. Instead of replacing the Ailu, they built their administration atop it. Families retained their traditions, their rituals, their leaders. In return, they contributed labor to state agriculture, construction, and military service. This labor tax, the mitar, became a political innovation that allowed the empire to accomplish feats impossible for any one community. Roads, terraces, fortresses, and storehouses grew from collective work that was both an obligation and a shared pride. As provinces folded into the empire, the Ailu system gave cohesion without erasing identity. It allowed an empire of extraordinary diversity to function as a single organism. But the structure of society was still evolving, pushing towards something more ambitious. Lords of the High Realm. At the heart of this expanding world stood the Sapa Inca, the unique emperor whose authority flowed from the sun itself. Yet the empire did not depend solely on one figure. It depended on a hierarchy of nobles, administrators, and stewards who orchestrated daily governance. The stakes for the ruling class were immense: maintain stability or risk revolt, guide the people or watch the empire fracture. Leadership was not a privilege, it was a burden carved into ritual and responsibility. Nobles studied quipu literacy, geography, and the oral histories of conquered peoples. They learned to negotiate alliances, to distribute resources from imperial storehouses, and to administer justice across diverse landscapes. The innovation of this class was administrative, not martial. They developed census systems, coordinated seasonal labor, and enforced standardized measures of land. Their decisions shaped the rhythm of life across thousands of kilometers. Still, even with hierarchy and order, new challenges awaited, challenges that would demand a different kind of endurance. The silent watch of the mountain. As the Inca grew in power, they learned that mountains were not merely obstacles or sacred guardians, they were strategic vantage points. High forts monitored travel routes, hidden pathways allowed armies to move unseen, ridgeline settlements provided early warnings of unrest. The stakes were tactical. Geography could be an ally or a threat, and the Inca treated it as both. Human watchers observed dust rising from distant roadways, listened for horns echoing across valleys, and studied the movements of neighboring peoples. This vigilance was a sophisticated innovation, an early system of surveillance made not through devices but through trained eyes and patient listening. The mountains became part of the empire's memory. They preserved warnings, witnessed change, and held secrets. But the greatest transformation lay still ahead, the shaping of an imperial identity strong enough to unite these vast lands under a single sun. And as the empire continued to rise, the world around it began to shift in subtle, unseen ways. This too was only the beginning. The circle drawn around Cusco. As the empire expanded, the city of Cusco, once a modest valley settlement ringed by farmlands, became the gravitational center of an ever-widening world. Its streets straightened, its districts gained purpose, its temples multiplied in quiet strength. The stakes for Cusco were unmistakable to remain worthy of commanding an empire. If the capital faltered, all four quarters would tremble. Human labor shaped the city with a discipline that bordered on reverence. Families dismantled old homes to rebuild them in the new imperial style. Stonemasons carved foundations that mirrored the order of the heavens. Priests walked the avenues at dawn, their robes brushing against walls, fitted with such precision that not even a blade of grass could slip between the stones. The innovation of Cusco was architectural philosophy, an understanding that a capital must be more than a seat of power. It must be a symbol of the world, arranged correctly, each quarter radiating harmony. But Cusco's transformation was only the beginning. The temple that held the sky. At the heart of the capital rose the great Coricancha, the temple of the sun, whose walls once shimmered with plates of radiant metal. Yet the temple's brilliance was not its splendor, but its meaning. It was a compass for the cosmos, a focal point where human devotion met celestial order. The stakes of this sanctum were universal. Here the relationship between the sun and the empire was affirmed each dawn. Here the Sapa Inca tied his authority to the celestial fire that lit the mountains. Priests tended flames that could never be allowed to die. They observed the solstice sunlight as it traveled across sanctified corridors. They interpreted omens from the flicker of torches and recorded histories in woven narratives. The innovation of the Coricancha lay in its dual purpose, a spiritual center and an astronomical instrument. Its windows framed the movements of the heavens, turning divine observation into imperial policy. But the wisdom of the temple would soon extend beyond its walls, the weavers of reality. As the Inca world grew more complex, another class gained prominence, the weavers. Their textiles, adorned with patterns that carried meaning far beyond decoration, became a language of power. The stakes of cloth were immense. Textiles served as offerings, tributes, diplomatic gifts, and sacred garments. They contained stories, genealogies, and symbols of rank. Women in the Akela Wasis, the houses of chosen weavers, created garments with extraordinary precision. Their fingers spun threads from llama and vicuña fibers, twisting them until they shone with a softness that defied the harshness of the mountains. Geometric motifs conveyed lineage, authority, and cosmic order. This artistic innovation was political. By controlling the production of textiles, the empire controlled the symbols through which identity and loyalty were expressed. But woven cloth was only one of the empire's instruments of cohesion, the great storehouses of survival. No empire endures on tribute alone. It endures on foresight. For the Inca, foresight took the form of vast storehouses, quilcas built along roads and high plains. These structures, simple in appearance, were among the most sophisticated logistical achievements of the ancient world. The stakes were obvious: an unforgiving famine or stability, hunger or endurance. In a land where drought might strike one valley and spare another, the storehouses became a bulwark against chaos. Workers filled them with dried potatoes, maize, jerky textiles, tools, and medicinal plants. Ventilation systems kept the contents cool and dry. Administrators recorded every addition and withdrawal with quipu. This innovation was infrastructural genius. It transformed unpredictable landscapes into predictable systems of support. It allowed armies to march without plundering and communities to survive harsh seasons without despair. But the storehouses were only a part of the empire's wider plan, the art of ordering people. As provinces multiplied, the Inca refined their methods of integrating diverse peoples. Conquest alone could not secure loyalty. The empire turned to a subtler strategy, mitmakuna, the resettlement of skilled families across regions. The stakes of this policy were cultural. If unity was to hold, knowledge had to flow, not stagnate. Crafts, technologies, and traditions needed bridges across mountains and deserts. Human caravans, families, artisans, farmers traveled to new lands under state guidance. They carried seeds, weaving techniques, architectural methods, and ritual customs. In turn, they learned from the people among whom they settled. This innovation accelerated cultural exchange. It reduced rebellion by mingling populations. It transformed conquered territories into contributors rather than subjects. Yet even with resettlement and shared labor, the empire demanded something deeper, a common sense of destiny beneath the sun, the measure of law. In the unfolding of empire, the Inca developed legal principles rooted in simplicity but enforced with consistency. Their laws were not written in stone, but held in communal memory and sustained by moral expectation. The stakes were ethical. Order depended on fairness. Fairness depended on clarity. The laws revolved around three essential precepts: do not steal, do not lie, do not be lazy. Human officials, curators, and magistrates applied these principles with measured judgment. Penalties varied, but the emphasis remained on restoring harmony rather than inflicting suffering. This was a socio-political innovation that enabled cohesion across vast distances. Rather than inundate communities with complex regulations, the empire aligned law with shared values. Yet as legal systems matured, new forms of authority began to test the empire's resolve. The rising tide of ambition. With each generation, the Inca leadership grew more confident, more secure, and more aware of the empire's expanding horizons. Ambition stirred in the hearts of rulers, ambition not for war alone, but for reshaping the Andes into a realm that matched their vision of cosmic order. The stakes grew heavier. Expansion required resources, resources required labor, labor required loyalty. In this delicate balance, the empire found both strength and fragility. Human rulers dreamed of new frontiers, coastal valleys untouched by imperial law, jungle edges alive with unfamiliar voices, mountain passes opening into lands yet unseen. Advisors debated strategies for incorporation and governance. Innovation turned toward centralization. Cusco demanded more from its provinces, more grain, more textiles, more labor. Some communities accepted these changes with pride, others with quiet resentment. The empire's pulse quickened, its breath grew deeper, its ambitions sharpened. But the wide world beyond its borders was shifting, carrying rumors and pressures that would soon reshape everything the Inca believed about permanence. This too was only the beginning, frontiers that beckoned like distant flames. As the empire settled into its rhythm, the Inca gazed toward horizons still untouched by their order. Beyond the highlands, beyond the familiar terraces and river valleys lay regions where landscapes shifted abruptly from desert to jungle, from icy peaks to humid forests. Each frontier carried both promise and peril. The stakes were enormous. Expansion meant access to new resources, new alliances, and new buffer zones against rival powers. But each campaign also stretched communication, tested loyalty, and risked unraveling the delicate harmony the empire had cultivated. Rulers in Cusco dispatched scouts, foot soldiers, surveyors, and negotiators into lands where the very air felt foreign. Human caravans braved treacherous cliffs, desert winds, and river crossings. They returned with observations carved into memory, coastal kingdoms with irrigation canals shimmering in sunlight, forest communities bound by kinship and ritual, high plains where herders followed the migrations of their llamas. Innovation took the form of adaptation. Instead of imposing a single model of governance, the Inca learned to fold each cultural landscape into the empire, differently respecting traditions when useful, altering them when necessary. But these new territories were restless, and they would soon challenge the empire's strength in unexpected ways. The fog of the western shores. To the west lay the desert coast, an austere ribbon of sand where rain seldom fell, but rivers carved fertile oases into the landscape. The Inca, unaccustomed to the dryness, approached this region with caution. Its civilizations were ancient, its systems of irrigation more complex than many highland rulers had imagined. The stakes along the coast were agricultural and strategic. Whoever controlled the river valleys controlled the lifelines that sustained thousands. Human engineers studied local canals, learning their angles and gradients, absorbing centuries of accumulated wisdom. Coastal leaders, some conciliatory, others defiant, evaluated the Incas' authority with wary eyes. Diplomacy alternated with conflict, alliances formed through marriage tribute and shared ritual. The innovation here was mutual exchange. Highland engineers brought new terraced techniques, coastal farmers shared irrigation knowledge. Together they expanded farmlands and improved harvest cycles. Yet the coast harbored its own tensions. Independent traditions clung fiercely to their autonomy. Some valleys resisted integration, prompting military expeditions that strained imperial resources. Still, the desert was only one part of the shifting frontier, the green threshold of the eastern forest. To the east, beyond the towering Cordillera, lay a world utterly unlike the highlands, the dense, humid expanse of the Amazonian edge. The Inca called it the Antisuyu, a land of thick canopy, powerful rivers, and peoples who cherished independence. The stakes were mysterious. The forests concealed both threats and riches, herbs of healing power, animals unknown in the highlands, and tribes who moved with ease through tangled pathways inaccessible to imperial armies. Human emissaries approached cautiously. Negotiators offered textiles and metal ornaments. Some forest groups accepted trade with curiosity. Others, swift and fierce, confronted intruders, with ambushes drawn from generations of guerrilla knowledge. Here, the empire's innovations faltered. The extensive road system could not penetrate dense forest. Terracing held no value. The rhythms of empire, orderly, agricultural, celestial, did not match the pulse of the forest. Thus, the Inca learned a rare lesson: not all lands could be shaped in their image. Some would remain partners, not provinces. But the eastern frontier had already revealed a deeper truth, one that would echo across the empire: the quiet pressure of distance. As far-flung territories folded into the empire, administrators confronted a growing problem: distance itself. No matter how well the roads were laid, no matter how fast the chasqui ran, the sheer scale of the empire created delays and misunderstandings. The stakes were administrative. A harvest failure in a distant valley could go unnoticed for weeks. A brewing rebellion might be discovered only when it had already gained momentum. Human officials did what they could. They tightened census procedures, monitored storehouse inventories, and held councils more frequently. They demanded stricter adherence to the MITA tax. They reassigned capable nobles to unstable regions. Yet distance remained a quiet adversary, present in every decision, every message carried across the stone highways. The innovation was subtle decentralization within centralized rule. Provinces gained provisional authority to act quickly in emergencies. Local leaders received training in conflict mediation and resource management. But even these adjustments strained the empire's unity. Small cracks formed, barely visible, easily dismissed but growing. And these cracks widened as the empire's ambitions continued to stretch outward. The march of armies. Along the high roads, military campaigns, once rare, now became routine. Each conquest demanded more soldiers, more provisions, more coordination. Armies marched along the high roads, their footsteps echoing against cliffs, their banners flickering in thin air. The stakes were military, political, and logistical. Victory strengthened the empire. Defeat could unravel years of diplomatic effort. Human commanders studied terrain with near-sacred seriousness. Ambush points, river crossings, seasonal passes all became part of a growing strategic memory. Soldiers, farmers during most of the year trained in formations designed for mountain combat. They carried slings, spears and clubs but relied as much on positioning as on weaponry. Innovation flourished in the construction of tambos, roadside lodges where armies could rest and resupply. These posts, stocked by local Ailu, ensured that troops moved swiftly without exhausting neighboring communities. Yet the increase in military activity shifted the empire's character. Expansion, once measured and diplomatic, now carried sharper edges. Conquest became expectation, and expectation in time burdens the world it seeks to order. The strain within the harmonies. With each new province, the empire's system of reciprocity, its supply chains, its ritual calendar, its labor obligations grew more complex. What once formed a stable circle of mutual dependence now stretched into a web that trembled under its own weight. The stakes turned inward. Could the empire maintain harmony without overwhelming its people? Could balance still be preserved as the center demanded more? Human families felt the changes. Some saw opportunity in imperial favor, access to new lands, new tools, new connections. Others felt pressure, increased labor quotas, stricter census requirements, longer campaigns away from home. Innovation attempted to keep pace. Administrators refined quipu records with greater granularity. Priests adjusted festival schedules to accommodate newly annexed regions. Storehouse managers planned distributions with unprecedented precision. Yet beneath these efforts lay a growing tension, the subtle fear that order itself was becoming too heavy to sustain. The empire still thrived, still expanded, still dazzled. But the mountains, silent and patient, knew the truth. All structures, no matter how well made, carry limits. The Inca had not yet reached theirs, but they were drawing closer. And this, too, was only the beginning, the turning of the cosmic wheel. As the empire reached its widest breadth, a quiet shift began so subtle that few recognized it first. The rhythms that had sustained the Inca for generations, harvest, ritual, census. Roadwork continued without interruption, yet each felt slightly heavier, slightly more strained. It was as though the cosmic wheel itself were turning, nudging the empire toward a new and unfamiliar season. The stakes were philosophical and practical. Could an empire founded on harmony endure once its scale exceeded the reach of its rituals? Could cosmic order still bind millions? When distance, ambition, and diversity pulled at every thread, human priests noted minor irregularities, festivals growing harder to coordinate, celestial alignments slightly obscured by climate shifts, murmurs of discontent carried across provinces. Administrators struggled to reconcile old records with new demands. Families weighed their loyalty to ancestral traditions against the expectations of empire. Innovation persisted despite the growing tension. Ritual specialists introduced slight adjustments to align ceremonies across far-flung regions. Quipu masters experimented with new knot sequences to track expanding obligations. Architects designed larger terraces to feed densely populated valleys, but harmony, once effortless, now required deliberate effort. And this effort marked the first faint shadow across the empire's radiance. The lineage of rulers and the burden they bore. Leadership, once stable and anchored in celestial ancestry, began to shift in tone. As new Sapa Incas ascended, each left a distinct imprint on the empire, sometimes strengthening its foundations, sometimes straining its unity. The stakes of succession were immense. Each ruler inherited not only authority, but expectation to expand, to secure, to honor the sun through achievement. A ruler who merely preserved the empire risked being judged inadequate. Human ambition hardened into policy. Some emperors favored diplomacy, weaving alliances across valleys and mountains. Others preferred decisive military campaigns to assert dominance. Advisors debated strategies late into the night, aware that the empire's direction hinged on each ruler's temperament. Innovation in leadership emerged through councils of nobles who carried institutional memory, offering continuity between reigns. Yet even their guidance could not erase the pressures of expansion. With every generation, the empire grew more demanding. Its complexities multiplied, its population increased, its achievements invited admiration, but also envy and resistance. and the throne, once a symbol of serene authority, became a seat of growing responsibility. The quiet resistance beneath the surface. Across the provinces, subtle forms of resistance began to appear, not open rebellion, but whispers, hesitations, and the slow erosion of enthusiasm. The stakes were social. If trust wavered, even devoted communities might falter in their obligations. Human farmers worked the terraces as they always had, but some noticed that imperial inspectors counted their harvests with stricter eyes. Shepherds guiding their llama caravans murmured that the Mitar demanded more every year. Local leaders found their authority questioned by imperial officials newly assigned to oversee their regions. In many places, these frustrations remained quietly contained. Families held fast to their sense of duty, offering tribute with the same reverence as their ancestors. But in other regions, particularly those farthest from Cusco, the discontent deepened into reluctance. The innovation that once united diverse peoples' reciprocity now trembled under uneven pressures. The balance between what the empire gave and what it required grew less stable. Still, no region fully broke from the Incas' orbit. The threads of unity held, but they quivered. The lands of the north, strength and strain. The northern reaches of the empire, rich in fertile valleys and vibrant cultures, became both a jewel and a challenge. Here, local traditions remained strong, shaped by centuries of pre-Inca development. These regions were well organized, highly productive, and proud of their heritage. The stakes were regional stability. If the north faltered, the empire's backbone would weaken. Human administrators in the north encountered social structures more complex than in many other provinces. Local nobles commanded deep loyalty and managed sophisticated agricultural systems. Their cooperation was essential, but not always guaranteed. The innovation of the Inca here was negotiation. They recognized the value of allowing certain customs to remain untouched, integrating northern city-states with a degree of flexibility uncommon elsewhere. In exchange, these regions contributed skilled artisans, fine textiles, and soldiers trained for organized warfare. Still, tensions simmered. Some northern leaders questioned whether imperial oversight was worth the demands it imposed. Rumors circulated that certain communities wished to reclaim old sovereignty. Nothing erupted yet, but the ground was warming. The whisper of unrest in the south. To the south, in lands touched by icy winds and rugged terrain, the empire pressed deeper into territories where loyalty shifted with seasons and circumstances. These were regions marked by fierce independence and long-standing local alliances. The stakes were territorial cohesion. A fracture here could ripple across wide distances. Human envoys observed that southern groups were less accustomed to centralized rule. Their leadership structures were distributed, their identities tied to nomadic cycles, hunting grounds, and ancestral spirits. The Inca offered gifts, alliances, and protection, but also imposed obligations that tested local patience. Innovation arrived in the form of adaptive governance. Instead of strict uniform rule, the empire employed rotating oversight, allowing local leaders more discretion. They built small administrative centers rather than imposing massive reconstruction projects. This approach eased tensions but did not erase them entirely. Trade flourished, but trust remained fragile. The people honored the sun, but often through their own traditions rather than imperial ceremony. The south would not break, but it would not wholly embrace the empire either. The foundations begin to tremble. As the sun traced its relentless path across the sky, the Inca Empire, though still magnificent, stood at a threshold. It remained strong, admired, and expansive, but beneath its stone roads and carefully tended terraces, subtle fissures widened. The stakes had shifted. What once threatened the empire from without now threatened from within: overextension, uneven demands, fragile loyalty. Human officials continued to manage crises with skill. Priests sustained rituals that bound communities together. Families worked fields that fed millions. All continued as before, but the mountains watched the empire with an ancient stillness, recognizing a pattern older than any dynasty. When civilizations reached their zenith, the horizon often carries silent forewarnings. Innovation still flourished. Wisdom still guided the capital. Yet no empire, no matter how bound to the sun, remained immune to change. The Inca continued to rise. Their world still shone. But the shadow of strain grew longer with each passing season, and though no one could know it, yet winds from beyond the horizon, winds carrying unfamiliar sails and unknown intentions, were already beginning to stir. This, too, was only the beginning, the gathering, weight of seasons. The Inca Empire, vast and intricately ordered, continued its steady march through the years. Its roads remained intact, its terraces fruitful, its rituals luminous beneath the gaze of the sun. And yet as seasons turned, administrators and farmers alike sensed a subtle heaviness settling across the land, as though the very air had learned to carry quiet burdens. The stakes, once purely material, had grown spiritual. Could harmony endure when the empire itself strained to maintain equilibrium? Could cosmic assurance remain unshaken when human structures faltered? Human communities felt this weight in simple moments, when the harvest came slightly later than expected, when Shaski arrived with messages of distant unrest, when elders whispered that rituals required more fervor than before. Innovation responded with resolve. Priests adjusted ceremonial calendars based on celestial observations. Farmers experimented with new seed varieties and terrace improvements. Officials refined quipu records with greater care. The empire adapted, but it did not breathe as effortlessly as it once had. The mountains, timeless and inscrutable, seemed to lean in, listening, waiting. The Sapa Inca and the rising burden of empire. As the empire's complexities deepened, the role of the Sapa Inca grew heavier. No longer simply the son of the sun, he became the axis around which thousands of decisions turned, decisions that bore consequences for millions. The stakes were existential. The emperor's wisdom or miscalculation could determine the fate of entire provinces. His reign could bring decades of stability or years of strain. Human rulers balanced tradition with necessity. They performed rituals before the golden effigies in the Coricancha. They convened councils of nobles listening to reports from every corner of the realm. They calculated how far the empire might still expand and where consolidation was needed. Innovation in this era centered on governance. Administrators developed more refined regional divisions enabling smoother communication and more efficient tribute collection. Royal inspectors evaluated local leadership with renewed scrutiny. But the Sapa Inca, despite his divine lineage, remained human, caught between duty and the empire's growing appetite. The throne, once a serene symbol of light, now carried the weight of stone, the surging pulse of the northern provinces. The north, vibrant and prosperous, became both a strength and a source of unease. Its fertile valleys, bustling markets, and ancient traditions made it a cornerstone of imperial identity, but also a region too powerful to ignore, too unique to fully absorb. The stakes were political. A strong north could support the empire or challenge it. Human communities in the north cultivated abundant maize, crafted intricate textiles, and upheld local religious traditions alongside imperial ones. Their cities were older than some Inca settlements, their lineages deep and revered. Diplomats walked carefully here. They offered incentives, honored local leaders, and integrated northern nobility into imperial administration. Marriage alliances were forged, gifts exchanged, festivals synchronized. Innovation lay in cooperation rather than dominance. The Inca learned to govern with a lighter hand, trusting local knowledge to guide regional affairs. Still, a faint restlessness simmered beneath the surface. The north remained loyal, but with a loyalty that felt conditional, anchored in respect rather than submission. And in that nuance lay both promise and danger, the unyielding frontier of the eastern jungles. Beyond the towering ridges, the eastern forests continued to resist imperial ambitions. The Inca had learned long ago that these lands could not be tamed by the same strategies that worked elsewhere. The stakes here were humility and survival. An empire accustomed to mastery found itself humbled by the forest's unpredictability. Human emissaries ventured along riverbanks offering gifts and seeking alliances. Some tribes welcomed trade and exchanged feathers, resins, and medicinal plants. Others viewed imperial presence as intrusion and answered with arrows and ambushes. Innovation in the East took the form of respectful limitation. The Inca built outposts along the forest's edge but rarely pushed deeper. They adapted foreign goods into their own economy, herbs that eased altitude, sickness dyes that enriched textile patterns. The jungle remained enigmatic, a realm that offered treasures but denied conquest. It was a reminder that not all lands would bow to the empire's order. The quiet strain of labor across the Andes. The myth of the labor obligation continued as it always had, but its demands grew heavier as the empire expanded. New roads required maintenance, new storehouses needed stocking, new armies needed provisioning. The stakes were communal endurance. A system once rooted in reciprocity risked becoming burdensome if imbalanced. Human families felt this strain in subtle ways: longer absences from home, stricter oversight from officials, increased quotas for textiles or maize. Some communities met these expectations with pride, viewing labor as service to cosmic order. Others whispered that the obligations had grown excessive. Innovation attempted to ease the load. Local leaders petitioned for adjustments to labor rotations. Engineers improved road surfaces to reduce maintenance. Administrators refined schedules to prevent excessive demands during critical agricultural seasons. Yet the tension persisted, not always visible but felt like a slow tightening of the ropes that bound the empire together. The Inca world remained stable, but stability now demanded vigilance. The murmurs of distant climate shifts. The Andes, majestic and imposing, carried their own cycles of drought, frost and rain that followed patterns known to generations. But in these years, subtle variations began to ripple across the landscape. The stakes were ecological. A slight shift in weather could mean famine for one region and surplus for another, testing the empire's logistical systems. Human farmers observed anomalies: colder mornings in unexpected seasons, rains arriving late, river levels rising without clear cause. Coastal fishermen noted changes in currents and the behavior of marine life. Innovation arose through adaptation. Priests consulted astronomical markers to reinterpret celestial messages. Farmers experimented with hardier seed varieties and diversified crops. Storehouses opened their doors more frequently, redistributing goods to stabilize regions affected by poor yields. The system held, but it held through effort rather than ease. Nature had begun to test the empire's resilience. The confluence of unseen forces. By now the Inca Empire had become a magnificent tapestry complex, expansive, brilliant in its achievements. But every thread bore tension. Every province carried its own challenges. Every season introduced new demands. The stakes were no longer simply about expansion or control. They were about managing the intricate symphony of an empire nearing the limits of harmony. Human leaders believed they could navigate these complications with wisdom and ritual, and for a time they did. Festivals continued, roads thrived, storehouses stood full, the cosmic order endured. Yet unseen forces, geographical, social, climatic, pulled quietly at the empire's foundations. None alone was enough to destabilize it. But together, slowly, steadily, they formed an undercurrent of vulnerability. The mountains watched, the forests observed, the deserts listened. And somewhere far beyond the empire's farthest road winds carried stories of strangers who had crossed oceans, strangers whose presence would soon ripple across the world in ways no oracle could foresee. The Inca did not yet know it, but their world had entered its final era of solitude, and this too was only the beginning. The winds that changed their song. The Andes had always known shifting winds, cold gusts from the southern ice fields, warm drafts from coastal deserts, humid breezes carrying the scents of the jungle. But in these years the winds carried something else, a faint unease, as though the world itself anticipated a change not yet visible. The stakes were intangible yet profound. Could the Empire's cosmic harmony withstand forces that came not from rebellion or drought, but from subtle tremors in the spirit of the land? Human communities sensed what their leaders could not name. Shepherds reported unusual migrations of birds. Fishermen on the western shores noted quiet lulls where once the water teemed with life. Farmers found their intuition passed down through generations faltering when predicting frost or rainfall. Innovation at first came in the form of careful observation. Priests extended their nightly vigils consulting ancient markers aligned with the stars. Agricultural councils updated seasonal plans. Diviners traced patterns in ash water and woven cords. Yet the winds continued to whisper stirring anxieties that could not be soothed. Something in the world was shifting, though none could say how or why. The tides of the coast and the pull of the unknown. Along the coast, where desert sands met ocean waves, communities had long perfected the arts of fishing and irrigation. Their rhythms were older than empire, older even than many highland myths, and yet even here, subtle disturbances unsettled daily life. The stakes were ecological and economic. The coast supplied the empire with fish, salt cotton, and abundant crops from its river valleys. If these regions faltered, the empire would feel the strain far into the highlands. Human fishermen noted strange currents that pulled their reed boats farther from shore. Nets returned lighter than expected. Drought visited some valleys sooner than predicted. Others saw floods that surged without warning. Rumors spread of distant lands experiencing similar irregularities. Innovation responded with resilience. Coastal engineers fortified canals, built higher embankments, and experimented with new fishing techniques. Communities adapted, as they always had, to the fickle temperament of the sea. But beneath their efforts, a worry grew: the sense that the ocean itself no longer followed familiar patterns. Something vast had begun to turn. The north stands taller, and shadows deepen. The northern provinces, prosperous and proud, felt a different kind of stirring. Their cities, vibrant with artistry, rich soil and ancient autonomy, had woven themselves into the empire with a mixture of cooperation and guarded independence. The stakes here were political. The north held the empire's most fertile lands and largest populations. Its confidence made it an anchor and a challenge. Human leaders in the north began to question imperial demands more openly. Tribute expectations fluctuated, labor rotations lengthened. Quipu inspectors arrived more frequently, scrutinizing harvest tallies with sharper eyes. Local nobles, deeply respected by their people, convened councils seeking ways to negotiate more favorable compromises. They reassured imperial envoys of their loyalty, but also reminded them politely, firmly, of the North's importance to the stability of the realm. Innovation emerged through diplomacy. The empire granted certain privileges, reduced quotas in select valleys, and appointed experienced administrators to ease tensions. But the North's voice, once harmonious, now carried an undertone of impatience. The more the empire stretched itself, the more the North became aware of its own strength. Pressure was building slow but steady, like water rising behind a dam. The South, where mountains guard, old memories. In the southern reaches, rugged, windswept and austere change came not from politics or climate, but from memory. These lands had long valued independence, moving to rhythms set by ancestral cycles rather than imperial decree. The stakes were cultural. If the South grew restless, its defiance could inspire others. Human families continued to herd llamas across high plains, hunt in shadowed valleys, and honor spirits who dwelled in stones and springs. They respected the Inca, but their loyalty was born of practicality rather than devotion. Imperial presence here was lighter, administrative structures looser, but even loose cords can fray. When imperial officials increased labor demands or requested additional troops for distant campaigns, southern leaders grew wary. They voiced concerns quietly. How much could the empire take before taking too much? How long could these lands offer service without exhausting themselves? Innovation in the south took the form of compromise. The empire allowed seasonal adjustments to tribute schedules. It accepted alternative goods in place of labor. It listened, at least for a time. Still, the South remained unpredictable, shaped by winds that had never bowed to any throne. And unpredictability in times of strain can ripple far. The pulse of the center, Cusco, feeling the weight. Back in Cusco, the radiant center of the empire, the fabric of governance tightened. Messages from distant provinces arrived more frequently, each carrying its own concerns, shortages, disputes, shifting alliances, complicated harvest cycles. The stakes were administrative. Even the most sophisticated system can strain when stretched across deserts, mountains, and forests. Human officials worked tirelessly. They analyzed Quipu cross-referenced census reports, debated strategies late into the night. The Sapa Inca presided with dignified composure, but the palace walls, stone though they were, seemed to hum with tension. Innovation blossomed in the heart of the empire. Scholars refined state rituals to reinforce unity. Road maintenance teams received expanded budgets. New storehouses arose along major routes. Each measure sought to preserve balance to keep the empire breathing evenly. But the empire had grown large, perhaps too large, and its heartbeat now quickened under the strain. Cusco remained brilliant. Its temples still shone with reverence. Yet even here, beneath the grandeur, administrators recognized the truth. The threads of unity required more care than ever before. Ritual as anchor, ritual as warning. In times of uncertainty, the empire turned to the one constant that had always given it strength: ritual. The ceremonies honoring the sun, the moon, the earth, and the ancestors unfolded with renewed solemnity. The stakes were metaphysical and political. Rituals stabilized identity and reaffirmed cosmic order, but they also revealed the anxieties that lay beneath the surface. Human priests noticed growing crowds at solstice festivals. Communities brought larger offerings, hoping for clarity, protection, stability. Sacrifices increased not out of desperation, but out of a desire to reaffirm balance. The innovation in ritual practice reflected adaptation. Processions were reorganized. New observances acknowledged the expanding boundaries of the empire. Priests incorporated symbols from distant provinces to foster unity. Yet within each ceremony lingered a quiet plea: let the world remain steady, let the sun continue its path, let the empire endure. And though rituals soothed hearts, they could not stop the winds of change gathering beyond the horizon. The distant horizon stirs. Unknown to the people of the Andes, far beyond any Chasqui route or imperial map, oceans stirred with currents carrying vessels unlike anything the empire had imagined. These distant movements were not yet visible, not yet spoken of, not yet understood. But the world was moving, not dramatically, not violently, yet unmistakably. The mountains heard it first in the silence between storms. The forests sensed it in the shifting habits of birds. The deserts felt it in unusual winds. The Inca Empire still stood strong, its terraces green, its storehouses full, its roads humming with life. But the subtle tremors in climate politics and spirit hinted that the world was preparing to turn in a way it never had before. The Andes, ancient and watchful, understood a truth the people had not yet realized: no empire remains untouched forever. And so as clouds thickened and winds whispered new patterns, the empire unknowingly approached the edge of a vast and irreversible chapter. And this too was only the beginning. The year the rains spoke differently. The Inca Empire, still radiant and orderly, entered a cycle of seasons that carried strange omens. Rains that once arrived with dependable rhythm now paused unpredictably. Storms gathered without warning, then broke apart as though uncertain of their own intentions. Frost descended early in some valleys and arrived late in others. The stakes were agricultural and spiritual. For an empire bound to the precision of the sun and earth, such irregularities stirred a deep unease. Human farmers watched the skies with the caution of those who understood how fragile abundance could be. Their terraces, shaped by centuries of wisdom, endured, but their confidence wavered. Priests lengthened their vigils, reading celestial markers with heightened intensity. Local councils debated adjustments to planting seasons, irrigation cycles, and storage strategies. Innovation emerged with urgency. Communities experimented with staggered planting to hedge against unpredictable weather. Administrators coordinated interregional distribution of surplus with unprecedented speed. The Inca adapted as they always had, yet the rains continued to whisper in patterns the empire no longer fully recognized. Nature was gently rewriting its script, the line dividing harmony from overreach. The empire's structure, once fluid and balanced, now strained at its edges. The demands of unity required coordination across deserts, mountains, valleys, and forests. Even the most devoted officials felt the burden of maintaining order amid growing complexity. The stakes had shifted from expansion to preservation. How could the empire maintain harmony when its own weight pressed against the limits of control? Human administrators faced an endless tide of decisions, disputes between provinces, delayed shipments, conflicting reports. Newly conquered regions needed integration, long-held territories needed renewed attention. Every thread of governance required constant tending. Innovation centered on efficiency. Quipu records grew more elaborate. New categories of officials emerged to handle specialized duties: storehouse managers, festival coordinators, inspectors of terraces, overseers of river canals. These measures strengthened the empire, but they also revealed an emerging truth: central authority, no matter how capable, could not foresee every shift across such vast terrain. Harmony required more than structure. It required breathing room, and breathing room was slowly disappearing. The northern echo of uncertainty. In the flourishing north, where fertile valleys yielded abundant maize and proud cities oversaw bustling trade, uncertainty took a sharper form. Local leaders, skilled, confident, historically powerful, began to examine changes in the empire with a critical eye. The stakes were regional influence. The north had always been vital, but now it became indispensable. Human leaders convened councils more frequently. They measured imperial expectations against their own capacities. They spoke in calm voices of loyalty, yet weighed the growing list of obligations. Tribute quotas rose, labor demands intensified, inspections multiplied. Northern nobles, wise and calculating, sought to protect their people while maintaining imperial favor. They negotiated terms, requested adjustments, and offered gifts. But they also prepared quietly for contingencies. The North had survived many eras before the empire. It would survive many after. Innovation emerged in the strengthening of local administrative networks. The North managed its affairs with increasing autonomy, even as it honored imperial festivals and sent troops when called. Yet beneath this cooperation lay a subtle tension that hummed like a distant drum. The North stood tall yet increasingly apart. The southern resilience and the murmur of doubt. In the rugged south, where winds carved ridges and valleys, communities continued their ancient cycles. They lived in step with the land, guided by traditions older than imperial decree. The stakes here were cultural endurance. The south valued its roots more deeply than any promise of unity. Human shepherds noted unfamiliar patterns in snowfall. Hunters observed shifts in animal migrations. Elders spoke of past eras when small changes preceded great upheaval. Their memories, long and detailed, carried a weight that imperial administrators sometimes underestimated. When the empire requested more troops, southern communities complied but reluctantly. When officials increased labor quotas, local leaders reminded them of seasonal constraints and sacred obligations. Diplomacy softened tensions, but suspicion lingered. Innovation in the south reflected their resilience. They adapted grazing routes, strengthened communal bonds, honored rituals with greater intensity, seeking guidance from ancestral voices. The South did not defy the empire, nor did it fully embrace it. It existed in a delicate balance, respectful, wary, alert. And balances, once strained, rarely recover their former ease. Cusco's radiance fights to hold. Steady. Cusco, heart of the empire axis of the four quarters, felt the growing strain with unmistakable clarity. Messages arrived daily. News of regional tensions, shifting climates, delayed tribute, unsettled omens. The palace, once a serene center of cosmic order, became a theater of ceaseless deliberation. The stakes were administrative clarity and political stability. The center had to remain steady if the periphery was to remain united. Human officials worked with tireless dedication. Nobles debated reforms to labor policies. Priests intensified rituals meant to harmonize the provinces. Military strategists reviewed frontier defenses. Every decision carried the weight of unseen consequences. Innovation flourished in Cusco's halls. New Quipu systems tracked ecological patterns across regions. Scholars proposed revised schedules for ritual synchronization. Artisans crafted ceremonial objects meant to renew unity during festivals. Yet, even within this brilliance, a quiet truth persisted. The empire was still strong, but it no longer felt invulnerable. The capital's heartbeat remained steady, yet faster, louder, more strained. The rituals that sought to mend the fabric. In uncertain times, rituals became the empire's anchor. The solstice ceremonies, once celebrations of cosmic assurance, now carried a somber undertone, a collective hope that divine order would steady the trembling edges of the world. The stakes were cosmic continuity. Ritual was not a performance, it was a stabilizing force. Human communities attended festivals in extraordinary numbers. Offerings grew larger, prayers lengthened, musicians played with solemn grace, priests interpreted every flicker of sunlight, every cloud movement, every rustle of wind with heightened intensity. Innovation blossomed in religious expression. New regional symbols were incorporated into imperial ceremonies. Rituals expanded to acknowledge ecological shifts. Priests emphasized unity, reminding all that the empire's strength lay in reciprocity and shared devotion. These efforts soothed anxieties. They renewed faith. But rituals, however powerful, could not restore certainty in the face of subtle compounding pressures. They could only hold the edges together for a time. The empire was not in decline, but its era of effortless order had ended. The edge of the unknown world draws closer. While the Inca navigated internal pressures and shifting landscapes, the outer world continued its silent transformations. Far across oceans, the empire had never imagined crossing movements unfolded that would one day ripple across the Andean mountains. The stakes of these distant events were invisible, yet they waited like storm clouds beyond the horizon. Human senses could not detect them. Priests did not foresee them in the stars. Farmers did not read them in the soil. The empire, brilliant and self-contained, felt no immediate threat. Yet in ports half a world away, ships prepared for voyages. New routes were charted. Certain men grew restless with ambition. The winds over the Pacific carried no warning. The sun shone as always. The mountains kept their silent watch. But history had already begun to turn toward the Andes. And the Inca Empire, unaware of what approached from beyond the sea, moved steadily into the final calm before the unimaginable. This, too, was only the beginning. The empire in its full illumination. The Inca Empire stretched proudly across mountains, deserts, forests, and coasts, entered a period of luminous stillness. Though tensions stirred in corners of the realm, though the rains arrived unpredictably, though distant provinces murmured with unease, the empire still functioned with remarkable coherence. The stakes, however, had subtly transformed. The question was no longer whether the empire could grow, but whether it could sustain its immense breadth without unraveling. Human communities continued their daily rhythms, tending terraces at dawn, guiding llamas along high roads, mending fishing nets on coastal sands. Ceremonies honored the sun with unwavering devotion. The Shaski ran tirelessly between provinces. Storehouses remained full. Armies stood disciplined and alert. Innovation continued to glow across the realm. Engineers experimented with new water channels to counter erratic rains. Administrators strengthened communication between regions. Priests refined observations of celestial cycles to maintain cosmic alignment. And yet beneath the empire's impressive resilience lay a fragile equilibrium, one that felt as if it were balanced on the sharp edge of a blade. The world remained beautiful. But beauty can be the last calm before transformation. The restless north, confidence turns to caution. In the prosperous north, where fertile fields unfurled beneath gentle sunlight, confidence had long shaped local identity. But confidence now mingled with caution. Recent seasons brought fluctuating rainfall, inconsistent yields, and rising expectations from the capital. The stakes were agricultural stability and political unity. If the north faltered, the empire would feel the shock deep in its spine. Human leaders in the north responded with characteristic ingenuity. They redistributed crops between valleys when harvests varied. They re-evaluated tribute obligations with care. They ensured that soldiers fiercely loyal to their own lineages remained ready but not overextended. Diplomacy grew more pointed. Northern nobles reminded imperial envoys of ancient agreements requesting adjustments in recognition of local needs. They offered loyalty but with clear boundaries. Innovation in governance emerged here with unusual subtlety. Local councils refined administrative frameworks more than the empire imposed. Northern rulers strengthened alliances across neighboring valleys, weaving networks that provided internal support, even as they upheld imperial ties. The north stood firm, but no longer unquestioningly. Its patience remained long, but not infinite. The southern edge. Loyalty in the language of wind. Far to the south, in lands shaped by vast plains, rocky slopes, and frigid winds, the empire's influence existed in a delicate harmony with older traditions. These communities valued autonomy, resilience, and ancestral wisdom. The stakes were cultural preservation and strategic loyalty. If the south withdrew cooperation, imperial campaigns could falter. Human families in the south watched the empire's recent shifts with keen awareness. They continued to send troops when summoned, yet elders questioned the growing frequency of requests. They offered tribute, but with careful negotiation to avoid straining their own resources. Local leaders were pragmatic. They knew the empire brought protection and trade, yet they also knew that overextension could undo even the strongest realms. Their memory stretched back through generations of alliances, rivalries, and wanderings. Innovation in the south took the form of selective acceptance. They adopted useful Inca technologies, metal tools, improved textiles, refined terraced methods, while maintaining rituals and governance structures that preserved their identity. The south remained, as always, a land of quiet strength. But beneath that quiet lay the sense that the empire's future was shifting. And the winds carried whispers of change. The joints of the empire begin to creak across the Andes. Subtle signs emerged, signs that would have appeared insignificant if viewed alone, yet together formed a pattern that hinted at deeper strain. The stakes were structural integrity. An empire does not collapse from a single blow, it weakens through 1,000 small pressures. Human administrators noticed delays in road maintenance in remote areas. Chasqui routes, though still reliable, saw occasional interruptions due to landslides or unrest. Storehouse inventories fluctuated unpredictably. Labor rosters became harder to organize as ecological shifts complicated farming cycles. Innovation sought to counter these trends. Terraces were reinforced, bridges were rebuilt with improved materials, provinces formalized contingency plans to support one another during shortages. Yet the joints of the empire, its roots, its administration, its cycles of labor, began to creak under the weight of complexity. The Inca still stood strong, but the symphony of coordination required ever more effort to keep in harmony. Cuzco, the radiant capital, at a crossroads. In the heart of the empire, beneath the golden glow of the Coricancha and the shadowed walls of Sacsayhuaman, Cuzco bore the immense responsibility of maintaining coherence across the realm. The stakes were existential. If the capital wavered, the empire could unravel. Human leaders sensed the growing tension across distant provinces, not rebellion, not hostility, but strain. Meetings in the palace grew longer. Advisors debated how to maintain unity without overburdening communities. Priests considered new rituals to reinforce cosmic order. Innovation accelerated. New administrative districts were proposed. Ritual calendars were adjusted to reflect shifting climates. Engineers planned ambitious reinforcements to the road system. But beneath these efforts, a quiet fatigue settled over the capital. Officials awoke before dawn and worked until stars silvered the sky. Even the Sapa Inca, still revered as the sun's descendant, carried the unmistakable gravity of a ruler who sensed that maintaining balance required more than divine mandate. Cusco shone as brilliantly as ever. But brightness can conceal the first shadows of inevitable change. The desert coast confronts the unfamiliar. The western coast, where ocean and desert coexisted in delicate opposition, faced challenges unlike those of the highlands. Coastal valleys depended on ancient irrigation canals and predictable river flow, both of which now showed irregularities. The stakes were environmental resilience. The coast fed tens of thousands. Its stability was essential. Human farmers adept at reading the land observed salt creeping farther into once fertile soils. They noticed river levels dropping unexpectedly. Fish populations fluctuated along the shoreline, altering seasonal patterns of trade. The Inca responded with characteristic ingenuity. Workers rebuilt canals with improved gradients. Reservoirs were dug to capture floodwaters. Coastal engineers collaborated with highland specialists to fortify embankments. Innovation ensured survival but could not restore the old certainty. The coast adapted, but adaptation hinted at something deeper. The world itself was shifting in ways that no empire could entirely predict. The forest frontier and the limits of reach. To the east, where forests thickened into labyrinths of green shadow, the empire's influence remained limited but persistent. Trade flowed, alliances remained fragile but functional. Yet here, too, shifts emerged. The stakes were border stability and cultural exchange. The forest's cooperation, though never guaranteed, had long been steady. Human guides noticed subtle changes in forest pathways, as if the earth itself were rearranging its patterns. River levels swelled after distant storms. Tribes that once welcomed trade approached with caution. Rumors spread of distant raids and shifting alliances within the forested world beyond imperial reach. Innovation focused on negotiation rather than expansion. Allied tribes were granted increased autonomy. Trade expeditions carried diplomatic gifts rather than demands. Inca emissaries listened more than they spoke. But the forest, alive with its own ancient rhythms, remained unpredictable. And unpredictability in a world already under strain added yet another tremor to the empire's foundations. The unseen horizon approaches. Across the entire realm, from the icy southern plains to the fertile northern valleys, from the coastal deserts to the dense eastern forests, the Inca Empire still held firm. Its roads continued to bear footsteps, its terraces still bore harvests, its priests still read the sky with reverence. But something subtle had changed. A quiet vulnerability had settled into the edges of empire. Not enough to cause collapse, not enough to spark rebellion, but enough that the mountains felt it. And while the Inca focused on the complexities of their own world, the true turning point of history approached from far beyond their gaze. Across the ocean, an ocean the empire had never needed to cross, ships traced routes toward lands unknown to them. Their movements were slow, distant, and entirely invisible to the Inca. But they were moving. The Andes remained silent, but not unaware. The world was preparing to shift, and the Inca Empire, despite all its brilliance, could not yet see what the horizon concealed, the sky above the four quarters. The Inca Empire, vast and breathing in steady rhythms, entered what would become its final season of unity, though no one within its boundaries could have foreseen this truth. The skies arched blue over terraces, temples and roads, just as they always had. Chasqui ran, priests prayed, farmers planted, children learned the stories of the sun. And yet the stakes of this moment were unlike any the empire had faced. For the first time, the forces that would alter the fate of the Andes did not rise from within its mountains or valleys. They came from beyond the world the Inca knew. Human senses detected nothing. The familiar cycles of life continued. The empire's structure remained intact. But something in the air, silent, unnameable, carried a distant vibration of worlds drawing closer. Innovation still flourished. Ritual still bound communities together. The empire still shone with the full radiance of its achievements. But the dawn that approached was not a dawn of renewal. It was a dawn that no tradition had prepared for. Cusco in its last radiance. At the heart of Tawantinsuyu, Cusco glowed with ceremonial brilliance. In the Coricancha, priests tended fires that symbolized the sun's eternal presence. Nobles prepared for festivals marking the turning of seasons. The Sapa Inca, adorned in garments of woven gold thread, presided over councils with dignified calm. The stakes were at their peak. Cusco had become not only the empire's center, but its symbol of cosmic order. Human officials continued their tireless work. They coordinated labor rotations, adjudicated disputes, and dispatched envoys to reinforce unity. The capital's halls echoed with measured footsteps and quiet deliberation. Everything appeared orderly, purposeful, whole. Innovation still guided decisions. New storehouses were built. Ritual calendars were refined. Officials sought better ways to manage distant lands. But beneath this radiance lay a soft, almost imperceptible tension, the sense that the world was holding its breath. Cusco shone brightest just before the shadow reached its gates. The northern valleys, strength on the edge of transformation. In the fertile north, the land remained generous. Maize ripened in golden tiers. Markets bustled with the trade of textiles, ceramics, and food. Yet local leaders carried an unspoken awareness the empire's demands had grown, and its needs were becoming more urgent. The stakes lay in a delicate balance between loyalty and self-preservation. Human councils met in stone chambers overlooking terraced fields. They debated tribute obligations, military rotations, and the empire's shifting expectations. They reassured imperial messengers of their allegiance, but privately acknowledged that the realm's stability now depended as much on regional wisdom as on decrees from Cusco. Innovation came through refinement. Northern provinces strengthened their own internal networks, ensuring that should imperial coordination falter, local structures would endure. These measures were not acts of defiance. They were acts of cautious stewardship. The North remained loyal but alert, prosperous but vigilant, steady but aware that the ground beneath the empire had begun to shift. The desert coast and its uneasy waters. Along the coast, where irrigation carved green lifelines through sand life, remained resilient. Fishermen still ventured onto the ocean in reed boats. Farmers tended fields nourished by river canals. Yet the sea, a steady companion for generations, now behaved unpredictably. The stakes were economic and ecological. Coastal valleys depended on both river and ocean. Changes in either could ripple across the empire. Human communities responded with the skill of old wisdom. They reinforced canals, moved settlements higher on the floodplain, and adapted fishing strategies to changing currents. But these adjustments were responses to symptoms, not causes. The deeper shifts lay beyond their reach. Innovation thrived in engineering and adaptation. Embankments rose stronger. Fishing nets grew more versatile. Trade between valleys tightened to support regions facing hardship. And yet the ocean continued its strange silences and sudden bursts of abundance, as though signaling that the world's faraway balance was beginning to fracture. The coast endured, but endurance carried a question. How long could adaptation outpace uncertainty? The southern highlands and their ancient resolve. In the south, where icy winds sculpted the land into stark beauty, life flowed according to rhythms older than empire. The Inca presence was strong here, but never dominant. Local leaders valued autonomy. Families cherished traditions that predated imperial rule. The stakes were cultural integrity and strategic importance. The South could support the empire or become a refuge for resistance. Human elders spoke around hearthfires of eras when great powers rose and fell. They offered these memories not as defiance, but as reminders of time's vast perspective. When imperial inspectors arrived, local leaders greeted them warmly but firmly, negotiating obligations with measured clarity. Innovation in the South lay not in invention but in continuity, knowledge of the land, memory of the ancestors, wisdom of the winds. These communities remained part of the empire but not dependent on it. Their strength lay in their self-sufficiency, their resilience, their unbroken ties to the old ways. The South watched the empire's tensions with quiet insight, sensing that something profound stood on the horizon. The forest frontier hears the first echo. In the east, at the boundary where empire met jungle, the world seemed unchanged. Trees rose in living cathedrals. Rivers wound through lush undergrowth. Birds filled the canopy with layered songs. And yet, the forest absorbed rumors that drifted outward from distant coasts, rumors of strangers sighted far away on unfamiliar shores, rumors of raiders with weapons that glinted oddly in sunlight, rumors of sickness following unknown footsteps. The stakes were undefined but potent. The forest, ever perceptive, often sensed shifts long before empires did. Human emissaries moving cautiously through tree shadow and river bend heard these stories with curiosity, then unease. They relayed them along forest edge paths where they traveled slowly toward highland officials. Nothing yet seemed urgent. Nothing yet seemed real. But the forest had listened, and the forest did not forget. The empire's breath falters. As the empire moved through this season of subtle tension, something intangible began to change. The roads, still busy, felt slightly slower. The terraces, still orderly, seemed slightly more burdened. The rituals, still radiant, carried a deeper solemnity. The stakes were spiritual. The Inca believed the cosmos spoke through subtle signs, not thunderous declarations. Human priests noticed omens in cloud patterns, in the behavior of animals, in the silence between wind gusts. They consulted oracles, made offerings, and adjusted ceremonies. Their efforts steadied the people but could not dispel the quiet truth that the empire stood on the cusp of transformation. Innovation persisted, but now it carried an undertone of preservation rather than expansion. The empire still thrived, still commanded mountains and valleys, still honored the sun with unwavering devotion. But its harmony had become delicate, woven with threads stretched thin by distance, climate obligation, and time. The dawn of distant sails. And finally, as though completing a circle that had begun long before any Inca ruler took the throne, the moment arrived quietly far from the Andes, unnoticed by every chasqui, every priest, every farmer. On a coastline unknown to the empire, sails rose, white, angular, alien. They belonged to men who sought wealth, land, and power, men who carried weapons of steel and gunpowder, diseases unseen in the Andean world, and ambitions shaped on distant continents. The stakes, though invisible to the Inca, were total. Human communities along that distant shore watched with wonder as these vessels approached. News of their arrival traveled slowly north and south, whispered from village to village. Eventually it crossed deserts, ascended mountains, followed river paths, and entered the empire in the form of scattered rumors. Rumors that no one yet believed. But the dawn had changed. The horizon had altered. And the age of the empire's solitude had ended forever. The Inca world still stood proud, strong, orderly. But history, vast, relentless, indifferent, had already turned its gaze toward the Andes. This was the end of the last calm, the beginning of an irreversible story, the moment before everything would change.